June 7th, 1944. Allied Field Hospital 33, 12 miles from the front lines in northern France. Rain pattered against the canvas tents as Lieutenant Eleanor Jackson finished her 20-hour shift, the mud caking her boots, weighing almost as heavily as the fatigue in her bones. The young nurse from Harlem believed the arrival of new medical personnel tomorrow would finally give her team the relief they desperately needed after weeks of non-stop casualties. She could not have imagined that her small act of kindness toward a wounded enemy would soon challenge everything her fellow soldiers thought they understood about humanity during wartime. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how one nurse's compassion crossed enemy lines and transformed not just a single prisoner of war, but an entire military base's understanding of what it meant to see the humanity in those society had deemed untouchable. The rain intensified as Eleanor made her way to the mess tent, her stomach growling after skipping breakfast and lunch. The field hospital had received 47 new patients that morning, American, British, French, and 3 German prisoners. Her hands still smelled of antiseptic despite scrubbing them raw. All she wanted now was a hot meal and her cot. "Lieutenant Jackson," called out Captain Morris, the hospital administrator, "supply truck is delayed another day. We're on half rations until tomorrow evening at least." Eleanor nodded, too tired to show disappointment. She approached the serving line where Private Williams handed her a tray with a small portion of beans, half a slice of bread, and a cup of watery coffee. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. "Best we can do tonight." "Thank you, Private," Eleanor replied with the practiced smile she had perfected, growing up in a world that rarely smiled back at her. She found a quiet corner and sat alone as usual. Despite serving alongside these men and women for 8 months, Eleanor remained an outsider. As one of only 9 black nurses in the European theatre, she had grown accustomed to eating alone, to the whispered comments, to being assigned the most difficult cases and longest shifts. Colonel Richards, the commanding officer, entered the mess tent, his presence immediately quieting the exhausted medical personnel. "Listen up, people. We've got intelligence suggesting a major push coming. Expect heavy casualties in the next 72 hours. Get sleep while you can." Eleanor felt her shoulders slump further. She had hoped for at least one full night of rest before the next wave. As she finished her meager meal, Staff Sergeant Martinez approached her table. "Lieutenant Jackson, the German in bed 17 is refusing medication. Doc Phillips wants you to try." Eleanor suppressed a sigh. This happened often. She was frequently assigned to difficult patients, particularly enemy combatants, as if her presence was itself a form of punishment for them. "I'll be right there," she said, gathering her tray. Bed 17 was in the farthest corner of the prisoner ward, separated from Allied soldiers by a canvas partition. As Eleanor approached, she saw a young man, perhaps 22 or 23, with bandages covering his left shoulder and chest. According to his chart, Unteroffizier Karl Müller had been captured 2 days earlier after his aircraft was disabled near Carentan. His blue eyes followed her as she checked his bandages. His face registered first surprise, then confusion, and finally a carefully constructed neutrality. Eleanor had seen this progression countless times. "Good evening, Unteroffizier Müller," she said in the careful German she had been studying since her deployment. "I need to administer your medication." The young man stared at her for a long moment before responding in accented English. "You speak German?" "Enough to get by," Eleanor replied, switching back to English. "Your bandages need changing." As she worked, she noticed Müller watching her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She had experienced many types of looks from German prisoners: hatred, disgust, fear, even occasionally respect, but his expression was different, curious, studying. "You are American?" he asked finally. "Born and raised in New York City," Eleanor answered, focusing on her task. "But you are—" he began, then stopped himself. "A Negro?" Eleanor provided the word, having had this conversation before. "Yes, and a lieutenant in the United States Army Nurse Corps." Muller was silent as she finished changing his bandages. When she offered him the pain medication, he shook his head. "Save it for others," he said. "My pain is manageable." Eleanor noted his refusal in his chart. As she turned to leave, Muller spoke again. "They give you smaller rations than the others. I saw this yesterday." Eleanor paused, surprised by his observation. It was true, though never officially acknowledged. She and the other black personnel often received slightly less at mealtimes. It was so common she rarely noticed anymore. "We're all on half rations tonight," she replied simply. Muller nodded slowly. "Where I trained, they told us Americans treat their Negroes as second class, that you would not even be allowed to treat German prisoners." Eleanor had heard variations of this before. German propaganda had made much of American racial segregation. "Yet here I am, treating you," she said. "Perhaps not everything you were told is true." She left without waiting for his response, continuing her rounds until well past midnight. When she finally returned to her quarters in the women's tent, she found a folded piece of paper on her pillow. Inside was a carefully drawn sketch of the New York skyline with a small note from Captain Andrews, one of the surgeons who had learned she was homesick. It was a small kindness that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Sleep came quickly, but was interrupted by the distant rumble of artillery that never quite left the French countryside. Eleanor woke before dawn, her body aching from exhaustion. She dressed quickly and headed to the mess tent for coffee before beginning another shift. The breakfast line was even more sparse than dinner, a small portion of reconstituted powdered eggs and a piece of toast. Eleanor took her tray and sat at her usual empty table, savoring the hot coffee despite its bitterness. As she ate, she found herself thinking about Mueller and the other prisoners. According to protocol, they would receive the same rations as Allied patients. But she wondered if that was happening in practice. She had seen how rules could bend under the strain of limited supplies and human prejudice. After finishing her breakfast, Eleanor made a decision that would alter the course of many lives. She wrapped her piece of toast in a napkin and pocketed it before heading to the supply tent. There, she filled a canteen with fresh water and added a small spoonful of precious sugar from her personal supply, a luxury she had been saving. The hospital was quieter in the early morning hours, with most patients still sleeping. She entered the prisoner ward and made her way to bed 17. Muller was awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, his face drawn with pain despite his earlier stoicism. "Good morning," Eleanor said softly. "How is your pain today?" Muller turned to her, surprise registering at her early appearance. "Tolerable," he answered, though the tightness around his eyes told a different story. Eleanor checked his bandages and noted with satisfaction that the wounds showed no signs of infection. "Your dressings look good," she said. "I can give you something for the pain now." This time Muller accepted the medication without protest. As he swallowed the pills with water from his canteen, Eleanor casually placed her wrapped toast and the sweetened water on his bedside table. "Our supply truck is delayed," she explained when she saw his questioning look. "I thought you might be hungry." Mueller stared at the simple offering, then back at Eleanor with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why?" he asked finally. Eleanor shrugged. "Because you're hungry, and I'm not particularly." It wasn't entirely true. She was already feeling the gnaw of hunger, but it was simpler than explaining her complex motivations. "You should not waste your rations on an enemy," Mueller said, though he made no move to return the food. "I'm not wasting anything," Eleanor replied, "and right now you're my patient, before you're anything else." She continued her morning rounds, trying not to think about the hunger that would undoubtedly plague her by midday. It was a small sacrifice, one that seemed insignificant against the backdrop of so much suffering. That afternoon, the expected casualties began arriving, dozens of wounded men from both sides of the conflict. Eleanor worked alongside the other nurses and doctors for 14 straight hours, her hands moving automatically from one patient to the next, barely registering their faces or uniforms. It was past midnight when Captain Morris found her slumped in a chair outside the operating tent, taking her first break in hours. "Lieutenant Jackson," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "There's something you need to see." Eleanor followed him to his office, a small partitioned space with a desk made from ammunition crates. He handed her a piece of paper. This was found among the personal effects of the German in bed 17, Unteroffizier Mueller. "It's addressed to you." Confused, Eleanor took the paper. It was a letter written in careful, precise English. "Lieutenant Jackson," it began, "when I was captured, I believed my life was finished. Not because I feared mistreatment from Americans, we had been told what to expect, but because I had failed in my duty. I was prepared to die resisting treatment or to survive only to face disgrace upon my eventual return to Germany. Then I met you, a person who, according to everything I had been taught, should hate me twice over, as an enemy and as someone who represents a regime that considers your very existence inferior. Instead, you treated me with more dignity than many of my own countrymen would have shown you. This morning you shared your rations with me when supplies were scarce. A small act, perhaps, but one that has shaken the foundations of what I believe to be true about the world. I have been a soldier for 3 years. I have done things I cannot speak of, things that will haunt me forever. I believed I was fighting for a greater Germany, for the protection of my homeland and people. Now I find myself wondering what kind of homeland rejects kindness and humanity as weakness. I do not know what will happen to me after this conflict, but I want you to know that whatever good I manage to do with the remainder of my life will be because you showed me that compassion can exist even in the darkest places. With deepest respect and gratitude, Karl Müller. Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. She looked up at Captain Morris, unsure how to respond. "Is he being transferred?" she asked finally. The captain nodded. "Tomorrow morning, all stable prisoners are being moved to the camp near Cherbourg." He hesitated before adding, "The intelligence officers found this quite interesting. They've been interrogating him for hours." Eleanor felt a surge of concern. "Is he all right?" "He's fine," Captain Morris assured her. "In fact, he's been surprisingly cooperative. He's provided information about German air defenses that could save Allied lives." The captain studied her for a moment. "Whatever you did, Lieutenant, it seems to have had quite an impact." Eleanor handed the letter back, but Captain Morris shook his head. "Keep it. It's addressed to you, after all." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "And Lieutenant, good work." It was the first genuine compliment she had received from him in 8 months of service. The next morning, Eleanor arrived early to say goodbye to Möller before his transfer. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, dressed in a clean prisoner uniform, waiting for the transport that would take him away. "I received your letter," she said simply. Möller met her gaze directly. "I meant every word." "You realize they will consider you a traitor," Eleanor said quietly. "The information you've provided will save lives," Möller finished for her, "both American and German. This conflict cannot end soon enough." He looked down at his hands. "I have a sister in Dresden, 16 years old. Everything I've done has been to protect her and our parents. But I've come to understand that the greatest threat to them comes not from outside our borders." Eleanor nodded, understanding the dangerous realization he had come to. "What will you do after the war?" she asked. "Teach, perhaps," Möller replied. "History should be truthfully told, not shaped to serve those in power." He hesitated before adding, "And you? Will you continue as a nurse?" "If they'll let me," Eleanor said with a small smile, "though I doubt Columbia University Medical School will be eager to accept a black woman any time soon." "They would be fools to reject you," Möller said with unexpected vehemence. "But then, the world seems full of fools." The sound of trucks arriving outside interrupted their conversation. Möller stood carefully, mindful of his healing wounds. "I have one request, Lieutenant Jackson," he said formally. "Would you accept a letter from me after the war? I would like to tell you what becomes of me, and perhaps learn what becomes of you." Eleanor hesitated only briefly. "I would like that," she said, writing her Harlem address on a small piece of paper, "though it may be years before mail service is restored." "I am a patient man," Möller replied, carefully folding the paper and securing it in his pocket. "And I have learned from an excellent teacher that some things are worth waiting for." The guards arrived to escort Möller and the other prisoners to the transport trucks. As he walked away, Müller turned back once and gave Eleanor a formal nod, not the Nazi salute she had seen some prisoners defiantly maintain, but a gesture of genuine respect. Eleanor watched until the trucks disappeared down the muddy road, then returned to her duties. She had patients waiting, and the war continued regardless of individual epiphanies. That evening, Eleanor was surprised to be summoned to Colonel Richard's office. She entered nervously, unsure what to expect. The colonel was not alone. Captain Morris and Major Phillips from Intelligence were also present. "Lieutenant Jackson," Colonel Richards began without preamble, "I've received some rather extraordinary reports about your interaction with a German prisoner, Unteroffizier Karl Müller." Eleanor stood at attention. "Sir, if I've violated any protocols—" "At ease, Lieutenant," the colonel interrupted. "You're not in trouble. Quite the opposite, in fact." He gestured to Major Phillips, who stepped forward. "Müller has provided us with crucial information about German defenses near Caen," the intelligence officer explained. "Information that will significantly reduce Allied casualties in the coming offensive." When asked why he chose to cooperate, he attributed his change of heart entirely to you. Eleanor remained silent, unsure how to respond. "I understand you shared your rations with him?" Colonel Richards continued, his tone neutral. "Yes, sir. We were on reduced rations, and I thought—" "You don't need to explain, Lieutenant," the colonel said. "Major Phillips has made it clear that your actions, however unorthodox, have produced invaluable results." Captain Morris cleared his throat. "There's more, sir," he said to the colonel before turning to Eleanor. "Mahler's letter has been circulating among the other German prisoners. 3 more have now come forward with information. It seems your act of kindness has created quite a stir." Eleanor felt a mixture of pride and discomfort. "I was just treating him as a patient, sir." Colonel Richards studied her for a long moment. "Lieutenant Jackson, I've been authorized to offer you a commendation for actions that directly contributed to intelligence gathering. However, the exact nature of those actions will remain classified. We don't want to advertise that German prisoners can be won over with toast and sugar water." There was a hint of a smile on his usually stern face. "Thank you, sir, but that's not necessary," Eleanor began. "It wasn't a suggestion, Lieutenant," and the colonel replied firmly. "Additionally, I'm approving your application for extended medical training in London. Captain Morris informs me you've applied 3 times without response." Eleanor glanced at Captain Morris in surprise. She had indeed submitted those applications, never expecting them to be forwarded up the chain of command. "The Army needs qualified medical personnel," the colonel continued. "Your performance here has demonstrated that you're more than capable." He hesitated before adding, "And perhaps it's time the Army Medical Corps recognized that talent comes in all colors." The meeting concluded with details of her temporary transfer to London for 3 months of advanced surgical training, an opportunity she had never expected to receive. As she left the colonel's office, Captain Morris fell into step beside her. "You should know," he said quietly. "Muller's letter made its way through most of the senior staff before it reached you. It's changed some minds around here." Eleanor nodded, uncertain how to feel about her private interaction becoming such a public matter. "I just did what anyone would have done," she said. Captain Morris shook his head. "No, Lieutenant, you did what very few would have done, and that's precisely why it mattered." Word of Muller's letter spread through the hospital over the following days. Eleanor noticed subtle changes in how others treated her. More invitations to join them at mealtimes, increased respect in professional interactions, fewer whispers behind her back. It was a bittersweet realization that it had taken a German prisoner's words to make her fellow Americans see her worth. 2 weeks later, as Eleanor prepared for her transfer to London, another letter arrived. This one from the prisoner camp, where Muller had been sent. It was shorter than the first, but no less impactful. "Lieutenant Jackson, I thought you should know that your kindness has created ripples beyond what either of us could have imagined. Here at the camp, those who heard my story have begun to question what they've been taught about Americans, about people of color, and about what this war truly represents. One man, an engineer from Munich, wept when I told him how you shared your rations. He said his brother, also a prisoner somewhere in France, had written of similar kindness from a black American soldier who saved his life under fire. Perhaps this is how change begins, not with grand declarations or political movements, but with individual acts of humanity that force us to confront our preconceptions. I remain your grateful patient, Karl Müller." Eleanor carried this second letter with her to London, where she excelled in her training despite being the only black nurse in the program. When she returned to the field hospital 3 months later, she found it transformed, not just by the progress of the war but by a subtle shift in its culture. Colonel Richards had implemented new policies, ensuring equal treatment of all personnel regardless of race. Captain Morris had established a formal mentorship program pairing experienced nurses with new arrivals, and he had specifically requested that Eleanor lead it. Even the mess hall had changed. Eleanor never again received smaller portions than her white counterparts. As the Allied forces pushed toward Germany in the final months of the war, Eleanor found herself thinking often about Möller and wondering if he had survived. She knew the conditions in prisoner camps varied widely, and that German prisoners who had cooperated with Allied intelligence faced particular dangers from fellow captives. In April 1945, as news of Germany's imminent defeat spread through Allied ranks, Eleanor received a message that a former patient was asking to see her. She entered the receiving tent to find Karl Müller, thinner and older looking than she remembered, but very much alive. He had been part of a prisoner exchange for wounded Allied soldiers, and his status as a cooperating prisoner had earned him certain privileges, including this brief visit before being transported to England. "Lieutenant Jackson," he said, standing as she entered, "I hoped I might see you once more." "It's Captain Jackson now," Eleanor replied with a smile. "How are you, Karl?" "Alive," he said simply, "and grateful for it. Many are not so fortunate." He hesitated before adding, "I have news of my family. My sister and mother survived the bombing of Dresden. My father did not." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, meaning it, despite knowing that Möller's father had likely been a supporter of the regime that would have considered her less than human. Möller nodded his acknowledgement of her sympathy. "I have been thinking about our conversations, about what comes after all this." He gestured vaguely at the world beyond the tent. "I've been permitted to study while in captivity. History, primarily. I want to understand how we came to this point." "And have you found answers?" Eleanor asked. "Not answers," Müller replied, "but perhaps better questions." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn notebook. "I've been writing about my experiences, about what I've learned, about you." He offered it to her. "I thought you might want to read it someday." Eleanor accepted the notebook, touched by the gesture. "I would be honored." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, discussing hopes for the future rather than dwellings of the past. Möller spoke of his desire to return to a Germany rebuilt on principles of equality and democracy. Eleanor shared her plans to use her new medical training to open a clinic in Haarlem after the war. When it was time for him to leave, Möller extended his hand. "I once believed that our differences defined us," he said as Eleanor shook his hand. "Now I understand that it is our common humanity that matters most." As promised in his first letter, Möller wrote to Eleanor after the war. His initial letters came from an internment camp in England, where he served as a translator and educator for other prisoners. Later he wrote from Hamburg, where he had secured a position teaching history at a secondary school being rebuilt from the rubble of the city. Eleanor replied with her own stories, of returning to New York, of the challenges she faced despite her military service and advanced training, of her eventual success in establishing a small medical practice serving the Haarlem community. Their correspondence continued for years, a friendship forged in the crucible of war that transcended the boundaries of nation, race, and circumstance. In 1952, Möller visited the United States as part of an educational exchange program. He and Eleanor met in New York, both now in their 30s, their faces showing the passage of time and experience. They spent an afternoon walking through Central Park, comparing the reality of Eleanor's New York with the sketch that had once given her comfort in a muddy field hospital. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Möller asked, as they sat on a park bench watching children play. "When you gave me your rations?" "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted, "though I never expected it to change so much." "One act of kindness," Möller mused. "Yet it altered the course of countless lives." Eleanor thought about the ripple effects of that morning, how Möller's letter had changed attitudes at the field hospital, how those changes had created opportunities for her and other black personnel, how the information Möller provided had saved Allied lives. how his teaching was now shaping a new generation of German youth who might never know the poisonous ideologies that had driven their parents to war. "I've spent years trying to understand why your kindness affected me so deeply," Muller continued. "I think perhaps it was because it came from the last person I expected to show compassion towards someone like me. It forced me to confront everything I had been taught to believe." "We all have those moments," Eleanor replied, "when reality contradicts our certainties and forces us to choose between what we've been told and what we've experienced firsthand." They parted that evening with a promise to maintain their correspondence, neither knowing that their letters would eventually be collected and published as Across Enemy Lines, Letters of Reconciliation, becoming an influential text in early civil rights literature and post-war German educational reform. Eleanor Jackson continued practicing medicine in Harlem until her retirement in 1978, mentoring countless young black medical students and nurses along the way. Karl Müller remained an educator in Hamburg, eventually becoming a leading voice in Germany's efforts to confront its National Socialist past honestly and ensure such ideologies never again took root in its soil. Neither Eleanor nor Karl ever claimed to be heroes. When interviewed for a documentary in 1967, Eleanor described her actions simply, "I was taught to see the humanity in everyone, even those we're told to hate." The field hospital where they met was dismantled after the war, its exact location now uncertain beneath the regrown forests of northern France. But the story of the black nurse who shared her rations with a German prisoner and the letter that changed hearts and minds across an army base continues to be told. A reminder that even in our darkest hours, small acts of kindness can illuminate paths toward understanding that no amount of hatred can permanently obscure. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, made it. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.